What happens when a man decides that his own life is worth less than the lives of his brothers? What drives someone to walk straight into a hail of machine gun fire not once, not twice, but over and over again until the inevitable finally catches up? June 22nd, 2013, a burning compound in Afghanistan's most dangerous province. Insurgent rounds tearing through mud walls like paper, and one Australian commando who refused to stop moving forward even when every instinct screamed retreat. Cameron Baird's final 90 seconds would earn him the Victoria Cross, but the story behind that medal reveals something far darker than any official citation will ever admit. This wasn't a hero's sacrifice born from a single moment of bravery. This was the culmination of 5 rotations, 5 deployments, 5 times returning to the same cursed valleys where the Taliban learned to fear the bearded Australians more than American airstrikes. 5 times volunteering to be first through the door, 5 times placing his body between his teammates and certain annihilation, until the 6th time never came. The Australian Defence Force will tell you Cameron Baird died serving his country. His teammates will tell you he died doing his job, but nobody wants to ask the question that haunts every special operations community. When does courage cross the line into something else entirely? When does selflessness become a system that devours its best men by design? What you're about to hear goes beyond the sanitized memorial speeches and the polished Victoria Cross ceremony. This is the story of a Sydney kid who became something terrifyingly efficient, a man whose 5th deployment probably should never have happened, a warrior culture that produces legends and then consumes them, and a final firefight in a compound they would later call the House of Termination, where one Australian operator made a choice that would define his legacy and expose the brutal mathematics of modern warfare. They gave him Australia's highest military honor. They built memorials in his name. But 8 years later, everything he fought for collapsed in less than 2 weeks when the Taliban retook Afghanistan. So was Cameron Baird a hero, or was he a symptom of a war machine that sacrifices its finest soldiers to delay the inevitable? Stay with me. Because what happened in that corridor reveals truths about courage, sacrifice, and the cost of endless war that nobody in power wants you to understand. The official story ends with a medal and a funeral. The real story is far more complicated and far more disturbing. The compound walls were already burning when Corporal Cameron Baird kicked down the 3rd door that morning. Smoke thick as wool choked the narrow corridor. Rounds punched through mud brick like fists through cardboard. Somewhere in the chaos, an insurgent machine gunner was tearing apart the Australian assault team with disciplined, withering fire. Baird didn't slow down. He didn't take cover. He walked straight into the kill zone with his rifle up and his jaw set like a man settling an old debt. That's the image that would define him forever. A Sydney boy who refused to stop moving forward, even when forward meant certain termination. This wasn't some reckless suicide charge fueled by adrenaline and stupidity. This was Cameron Baird doing what he'd done on every deployment, every firefight, every cursed valley in Uruzgan province. He was buying time for his mates with his own body. The machine gun swung toward him. He fired first. The insurgent dropped. Baird kept moving. Another fighter appeared from a side room. Baird put him down before the man could raise his AK. Then the walls erupted again. But that was just the beginning of the nightmare unfolding in that Afghan compound. This time, the rounds found their mark. Cameron Baird fell in that corridor on June 22nd, 2013. He was 32 years old. He'd been in Afghanistan for his 5th rotation. He'd earned a medal for gallantry 4 years earlier for similar insanity, charging enemy positions to break ambushes, exposing himself to draw fire away from wounded soldiers. The Australian Defence Force would posthumously award him the Victoria Cross, the highest military honor in the Commonwealth. None of that tells you who Cameron Baird really was. None of that explains why a laid-back kid from Burraneer Bay became the kind of man who treated enemy fire like a minor inconvenience. The real story starts years before that final firefight. It starts with a teenager who joined the army at 17, not because he was running from something, but because he'd found exactly what he wanted. Baird enlisted in 1998, straight out of high school. No drama, no broken home, no chip on his shoulder. Just a clean-cut kid with a savage work ethic and zero tolerance for half measures. He passed selection for the Special Air Service Regiment in 2006. That's Australia's Tier 1 unit, the guys who don't exist on paper but do all the work that keeps politicians sleeping soundly at night. SASR selection is a nightmare designed to break you in the first 48 hours. Candidates ruck through the Blue Mountains carrying 80-pound packs in freezing rain, sleep deprivation, constant harassment, navigate or fail. Most quit before the first weekends. Baird didn't just pass, he thrived. His instructors noted something unusual. The harder they pushed, the calmer he got. Where other candidates would crack under stress, Baird would smile, not a cocky grin, more like quiet satisfaction. Like he'd finally found a challenge worth his time. What nobody realized then was how that same drive would eventually consume him completely. Afghanistan became his proving ground. He deployed in 2007, right when the war was transitioning from peacekeeping theater to full-blown counterinsurgency grind. The Taliban had regrouped. Helmand and Uruzgan provinces were turning into meat grinders. Coalition forces were getting hammered in green zones, those lush river valleys where thick vegetation and mud-walled compounds gave insurgents every advantage. Firefights that should have lasted minutes stretched into hours. Ambushes came from 360 degrees. Baird loved every second of it. His first rotation established the pattern that would define his career. Patrol, contact, assault. Repeat until the enemy stopped moving. SASR operates differently than American units. No massive air support packages, no convoy of armored vehicles, just small teams in beat-up Land Rovers, hunting Taliban command elements in places where nobody else wanted to go. Baird fit into that culture like a bullet in a chamber, efficient, deadly, uncomplicated. The firefight that earned him the Medal for Gallantry happened in 2009 during Operation Spingar. His patrol was ambushed in the Chora Valley, a Taliban stronghold so dangerous that even talking about it made intelligence officers nervous. The insurgents had set up a perfect kill zone, heavy machine guns in elevated positions, RPG teams covering the flanks, interlocking fields of fire that turned the valley floor into a shooting gallery. Baird's team was pinned down within seconds, but what happened next would shock even the most hardened operators in theater. Most soldiers in that situation would have gone to ground, called for air support, waited for the cavalry. Baird saw 2 wounded Afghans caught in the open, taking rounds from multiple directions. He didn't ask permission, didn't wait for covering fire. He just stood up and ran into the bullet storm like he was late for a bus. Tracer rounds drew neon lines through the dust. RPGs detonated close enough to rattle his teeth. Baird grabbed the first casualty, dragged him to cover, went back for the second. Then he started returning fire. Here's where it gets interesting. Baird didn't spray and pray like you see in movies. He moved methodically from position to position, engaging targets with disciplined, accurate fire. Every time the Taliban shifted to concentrate on him, his teammates would maneuver. Every time they focused on his teammates, Baird would pop up somewhere else. He turned himself into a one-man fire support element, drawing attention like a magnet draws iron filings. The ambush collapsed. The Taliban withdrew. Baird reloaded and kept pushing forward. The citation for his Medal for Gallantry used words like courageous and selfless. That's military speak for certifiably insane. Baird didn't see it that way. In interviews afterward, he shrugged it off like he'd helped someone change a tire. Just doing the job, mate, nothing special. That attitude drove his officers crazy and made his teammates worship him because in the SASR, humility is currency. Guys who brag don't last. Guys who deliver without fanfare become legends. Yet this was only scratching the surface of what Baird would become in the years ahead. Between deployments, Baird was the opposite of what you'd expect from a Tier 1 operator. No ego, no war stories at bars. He'd go home to Sydney, hang out with old school friends who had no idea what he did for a living, surf, drink beer, laugh at stupid jokes. His family described him as gentle, thoughtful, the kind of guy who'd help elderly neighbors with their groceries without being asked. Then he'd fly back to Afghanistan and turn into something else entirely. His second deployment saw more of the same. Ambushes, close quarters battles, villages that had to be cleared room by room while insurgents used women and children as shields. The rules of engagement were impossibly complicated. Shoot too soon, you create a propaganda disaster. Hesitate too long, you're gone. Baird navigated that gray zone with instincts that couldn't be taught. He knew when to fire and when to hold, when to push and when to wait. That kind of judgment separates good soldiers from great ones. Here's what nobody talks about: the psychological cost of doing that job rotation after rotation. Most special operations soldiers tap out after 3 or 4 deployments. The stress accumulates. Marriages fall apart. Substance abuse creeps in. Mental health deteriorates. Baird kept going back. 5 rotations, 5 times watching friends get hit, 5 times clearing compounds where every doorway might hide someone willing to perish just to take you with them. The changes were subtle at first, but they were building towards something catastrophic. His teammates started noticing differences around the 3rd deployment. Nothing dramatic, just small things. Baird got quieter, more intense. The jokes came less frequently. The 1,000-yard stare lasted a little longer after firefights. In the SASR culture, you don't talk about feelings. You don't admit weakness. You just keep grinding until something breaks. Baird kept grinding. The mission that would ultimately take his life started like dozens of others. June 2013. A joint Australian-Afghan operation targeting a Taliban command and control node in Chora Valley, Uruzgan province. Intelligence indicated a high-value target was using a fortified compound as an operations center. The plan was textbook: cordon the area, clear the buildings, capture or eliminate the leadership. Simple on paper. Afghanistan has a way of shredding paper. Baird's troop inserted before dawn. The compound sat in typical Afghan architecture: thick mud walls, multiple buildings connected by narrow alleyways, flat roofs perfect for snipers. As they approached, the firing started. Not the chaotic spray of untrained fighters, but disciplined, controlled bursts from multiple positions. These guys knew what they were doing. They'd fortified the compound specifically to eliminate special operations raiders. The assault team breached the outer wall and immediately took casualties. An Afghan commando went down, then another. Baird moved forward to extract them while the rest of the team tried to establish fire superiority. The problem was the compound's design. Every time they cleared one room, insurgents would pop up in another. It was like fighting ghosts who knew every corner, every firing position, every escape route. What the Australians didn't know was that they'd walked into the most lethal trap of the entire war. Baird organized a small element to push deeper into the compound. The logic was brutal but sound. If they stayed in the outer buildings, the Taliban would just keep reinforcing and the casualties would mount. They needed to break the enemy's command structure by getting to the leadership before they could organize a proper defense. So Baird led his team into the heart of the kill zone. Room by room, they advanced. The fighting was so close you could hear the enemy breathing. Grenades bounced off walls. Muzzle flashes lit up doorways. The air stank of cordite and blood and burning wood. Baird was always first through each door, always the one taking the greatest risk. His teammates would later describe him as calm, focused, like he'd done this 1,000 times before and would do it 1,000 times more. Then they hit the main building, the House of Termination as it would later be called. The structure was a fortress within a fortress. Thick walls, minimal windows, multiple rooms connected by a central corridor that funneled attackers into a pre-sited kill zone. The Taliban had concentrated their best fighters there. They weren't running, they were waiting. And what waited inside would change everything in the next 90 seconds. Baird kicked in the door. The machine gun opened up immediately. The first burst missed him by inches. The second burst tore apart the doorframe. Baird returned fire, eliminating the gunner. Then another insurgent appeared. Baird engaged him. Another appeared, and another. The building was packed with fighters who'd made their choice. They were finishing their stand in that compound, and they were taking as many coalition forces with them as possible. Here's where the accounts get fragmentary because everyone who was there was fighting for their lives in a space smaller than a tennis court. What's clear is that Baird kept pushing forward. He cleared multiple rooms. He neutralized multiple insurgents. He created enough chaos that his teammates could maneuver and extract casualties. Then the machine gun that everyone thought was silent came back to life. The rounds hit Baird in the chest and head. He went down in the corridor. His teammates tried to reach him, but the fire was too intense. They had to pull back, regroup, and assault again. When they finally retook that section of the building, Cameron Baird was gone. The medics tried everything, but the wounds were catastrophic. The kid from Bernier Bay, who'd walked into that compound knowing exactly what waited for him, had paid the final price. Yet the true cost of that day was only beginning to reveal itself. The aftermath was complicated. The mission succeeded. The Taliban leadership was eliminated. The compound was secured, and Australian casualties were limited because Baird had absorbed so much enemy attention. Victories in Afghanistan always felt hollow. You'd clear a village, lose good men doing it, and 6 months later, the Taliban would be back. The grind never stopped. The cost kept mounting. Baird's funeral drew thousands. Politicians gave speeches about sacrifice and service. The military posthumously awarded him the Victoria Cross for Australia, the first SASR operator to receive it since the Vietnam War. And the citation described his actions in detail, using phrases like exceptional courage and selfless valor, all true, all insufficient to capture what actually happened in that compound, because the Victoria Cross tells you what Cameron Baird did, but it doesn't tell you why. It doesn't explain how a gentle kid who helped old ladies with groceries became the kind of man who'd walk into a machine gun nest without hesitation. It doesn't address the deeper questions about what repeated combat deployments do to the human psyche. And it definitely doesn't acknowledge the moral complexity of a war where valor and futility often existed in the same moment, but the darkest revelations were still years away from coming to light. His teammates struggled with his passing in ways that outsiders couldn't understand. In the SASR, you're trained to be the best, to never quit, to win every fight through superior skill and willpower. Then you watch someone like Baird, who embodied all those qualities, get eliminated doing exactly what he was trained to do. It breaks something fundamental in your worldview. If the best guy can be taken out, what does that say about your own chances? The investigation that followed revealed uncomfortable truths about equipment and support. Baird and his team were operating with gear that was outdated compared to American units. Their body armor was older. Their communication systems were less sophisticated. They compensated with superior training and aggressive tactics. But there are limits to what flesh and blood can overcome. The Australian Defence Force promised improvements. Some came. Many didn't. Focus on equipment misses the larger point. Cameron Baird didn't perish because his vest was old or his radio was clunky. He went down because he voluntarily placed himself between his teammates and overwhelming firepower. That's a choice, not an equipment failure. The question isn't whether better gear would have saved him. The question is why someone keeps making that choice rotation after rotation until statistics catch up. The answer lives in the SASR culture itself. These aren't professional soldiers who clock in and clock out. They're true believers in a specific code. You never leave a man behind, you never quit, and when it gets bad, you step forward instead of back. Baird internalized that code so completely that it became his default setting. Danger didn't trigger retreat, it triggered aggression. That mindset wins battles. It also ends lives eventually. And the pattern was repeating itself across the entire special operations community. In Afghanistan, veterans often describe a strange phenomenon. The best guys go first, not because they're reckless, but because they're the ones who volunteer for the most dangerous positions. Point man, breacher, vehicle commander, the roles that put you first into the kill zone. Baird held those positions constantly. Over 5 deployments, he'd accumulated hundreds of close calls. Each time, he walked away. Until he didn't. The Taliban fighters who defended that compound weren't random insurgents. They were experienced, committed jihadists who'd been fighting coalition forces for years. They knew exactly who they were facing. Australian SASR had a reputation in Uruzgan province that bordered on mythical, the bearded ones who drove open-topped vehicles, who patrolled for weeks without resupply, who appeared out of nowhere and disappeared just as fast. The Taliban feared them more than American airstrikes. Fear doesn't always translate to surrender. Sometimes it translates to desperation. The fighters in that compound knew they were going to perish. The Australians had them surrounded. Air support was minutes away. Surrender meant Guantanamo or a black site somewhere. So they chose to go down fighting, and they chose to take as many SASR operators with them as possible. Baird walked into that calculus and paid for it. What emerged from the rubble would haunt Australian defense policy for the next decade. The propaganda war that followed his passing was predictable and disgusting. Taliban spokesmen claimed they'd eliminated dozens of Australian soldiers. Australian politicians used his sacrifice to justify continued operations. Neither side acknowledged the obvious. The war was unwinnable, had been unwinnable for years, and young men like Cameron Baird were being lost to maintain the fiction that political will could overcome strategic reality. His Victoria Cross citation focused on specific acts, engaging multiple insurgents, exposing himself to fire, protecting wounded soldiers. Reading between the lines reveals something darker. Baird was awarded the nation's highest honor for doing in the final moments what he'd done throughout his service, serving as a human shield. That's not a criticism. That's an observation about how we celebrate sacrifice while ignoring the systems that demand it. The memorial service in Sydney drew his family, his teammates, politicians, and thousands of strangers who wanted to pay respects to someone they'd never met. His mother gave a speech that gutted everyone present. She talked about Cameron as a child. Curious, energetic, always helping others. She talked about the phone calls before each deployment, the promises to be careful, the assurances that he was doing important work. She didn't mention that she'd been receiving those calls for 6 years, knowing that each one might be the last. His teammates gave eulogies that were heavy on humor and light on details. That's the SASR way, that you celebrate the man without revealing the work. They talked about Baird's terrible jokes, his love of practical jokes, his ability to stay calm when everything was falling apart. They didn't talk about the specific missions, the body count, the moral compromises that modern warfare demands. Those stories stay in the unit. Yet one question hung over the entire ceremony like a storm cloud nobody wanted to acknowledge. Was Cameron Baird's sacrifice worth it? Did his actions accomplish anything meaningful? The compound was cleared, the Taliban leadership was eliminated. Then what? 6 months later, different Taliban were using different compounds to plan different attacks. The cycle never stopped. Good men kept being lost to delay the inevitable. Afghanistan would fall to the Taliban in August 2021, 8 years after Baird's passing. The Afghan government collapsed in days. The military that Australian and American soldiers had trained and equipped abandoned their positions without significant resistance. Everything that men like Cameron Baird fought for evaporated in less than 2 weeks. The images of people clinging to departing aircraft were a perfect metaphor for 20 years of failed policy. Measuring Baird's life by strategic outcomes is unfair and incomplete. He didn't make policy. He didn't choose the mission. He was given an impossible task. Fight a counterinsurgency war with one hand tied behind your back, win hearts and minds in a place where your presence creates more insurgents than you can neutralize, and do it all while following rules that your enemy ignores. Baird did that job better than almost anyone. The fact that the strategy was doomed doesn't diminish his courage, but it raises uncomfortable questions about what courage means when the cause is lost. The Victoria Cross he earned sits in the Australian War Memorial in Canberra. Visitors can see it behind glass, read the citation, learn about his final firefight. What they can't see is the cost and the 5 deployments that changed a gentle kid into someone who could walk into a machine gun nest without flinching. The relationships that strained under the weight of secrets he couldn't share. The nights he probably spent staring at ceilings, wondering how many more times he could roll the dice before his luck ran out. His legacy in the SASR is complicated. He's simultaneously held up as the ideal operator and a cautionary tale. The ideal because he embodied everything the regiment values: courage, selflessness, competence under pressure. The cautionary tale because his passing highlighted the unsustainable nature of constant high-tempo operations. You can't keep sending the same small group of men into the worst fights and expect them to survive indefinitely. Statistics don't care about skill. The investigations into SASR conduct in Afghanistan that emerged years later added another layer of complexity. Allegations of war offenses, rules of engagement violations, the murky gray zone between legitimate combat and atrocity. Baird's name never appeared in those investigations. His conduct was always professional. He operated in the same environment, faced the same impossible choices, witnessed the same moral erosion that comes from fighting an endless war with no clear victory conditions. And that context reveals the pressure cooker that forged men like Cameron Baird. When you deploy to the same violent province 5 times, when you see friends go down in ambushes that intelligence failures should have prevented, when you capture insurgents who are released and eliminate more coalition soldiers weeks later, that creates rage. Rage in highly trained, heavily armed men is dangerous. Some channeled it into professional excellence. Others crossed lines they couldn't uncross. Baird's teammates insist he never crossed those lines. Every enemy he neutralized was actively trying to end him or his team. Every risk he took was calculated to save Australian and Afghan lives. The Victoria Cross Committee agreed. The broader question remains, what does it do to a man's soul to spend years living in that space between lawful combat and atrocity? Even if you never cross the line yourself, watching others cross it changes you. The Australian public's relationship with the war was always ambivalent. Unlike Americans who were saturated with war and terror messaging, Australians kept a certain distance. The deployments were smaller. The casualties were fewer. The media coverage was limited. Most Australians supported the troops in an abstract sense, but couldn't name a single battle or operation. Cameron Baird became famous in passing because his Victoria Cross forced people to acknowledge what was happening in those distant valleys. His story was packaged for public consumption in predictable ways. Hero saves his mates. Ultimate sacrifice. Defending freedom. All those narratives are true but incomplete. They skip over the parts that make people uncomfortable, like the fact that Baird's fifth deployment probably shouldn't have happened, like the reality that rotation policies exist precisely to prevent soldiers from accumulating so much combat stress that judgment fails, like the question of whether sending him back again and again represented leadership or negligence. The families of fallen soldiers rarely criticize the military publicly. Too much grief, too much pride, too much respect for the institution their loved ones served. Baird's family was no exception. They spoke about his dedication, his love for his teammates, his belief in the mission. You have to wonder what they thought privately when the war ended in total defeat, when every sacrifice was rendered meaningless by political decisions made thousands of miles away. The surviving members of his team carried their own burdens. Survivors' guilt is real and vicious. They'd been in the same compound, faced the same fire, made it out while Baird didn't. Logic says that's random chance. The machine gun could have hit anyone. Emotion says you should have been faster, braver, better. Those guys live with that dissonance every day. Some left the military immediately after Baird's passing. Others stayed for years, trying to honor his memory by continuing the work. All of them were changed. You don't watch someone like Cameron Baird go down and then just go back to normal life. The war follows you home. It lives in unexpected sounds, in crowds that feel threatening, in the inability to explain to civilians why you can't enjoy fireworks anymore. The training regimen at SASR selection changed after his passing, not because he did anything wrong. He did everything right. The military recognized that producing operators who would willingly sacrifice themselves created a systemic problem. You need aggression and courage, but you also need soldiers who survive long enough to pass on institutional knowledge. The balance is delicate and constantly shifting. His weapons and equipment were preserved and placed in the war memorial. His rifle, his body armor, his patrol pack, artifacts of a life spent in the most dangerous places doing the most dangerous work. Museum visitors look at them and try to imagine the weight, the heat, the terror. They can't. You have to have been there to understand, and even then, every combat experience is unique. The media coverage of his passing was respectful but sanitized. Newspapers printed photos of him smiling in uniform. Television stations showed footage of his funeral. Nobody showed pictures of what a machine gun does to human flesh. Nobody described the sounds his teammates heard when he was hit. The public got a version of events that honored sacrifice without acknowledging horror. That sanitization is necessary for public morale, but dishonest about the reality of combat. War isn't clean or noble or cinematic. It's terrifying and chaotic, and often senseless. Men like Cameron Baird navigate that chaos through training and instinct, but there are still human beings who bleed when shot. The mythology that grows around fallen heroes sometimes obscures that fundamental truth. His Victoria Cross was presented to his family by the Governor-General in a ceremony full of tradition and formality. His parents accepted it with the dignity expected of them, while internally screaming at the unfairness of trading their son for a piece of metal. That's the bargain military families make. We'll give you our children, and you'll give us back memories and medals. It's never fair trade. The speeches at the ceremony emphasized duty, honor, and service. Politicians praised Baird's courage. Military leaders described him as the embodiment of SASR values. Everyone carefully avoided mentioning that those same values had sent him into a kill zone 5 times until probability caught up. Nobody questioned whether the mission was worth the sacrifice. The ceremony existed to celebrate, not interrogate. Years later, documentary filmmakers tried to capture his story. They interviewed teammates, family members, military historians. They used dramatic recreations to show the firefight. Something essential was always missing: the actual experience of being Cameron Baird in that moment, the decision-making process that led him to kick down that door, knowing what waited on the other side. The thoughts going through his head in those final seconds, those went down with him. His legacy lives on in the SASR in tangible ways. New recruits are taught about his actions as examples of operational excellence. His name appears on memorial walls. Annual ceremonies remember his sacrifice. The organization also learned darker lessons from his passing, about the limits of individual courage, the importance of combined arms support, the need for better intelligence preparation of the battlefield. The compound where he fell was destroyed shortly after the battle. Standard procedure: deny the enemy defensive positions. It also erased the physical space where Cameron Baird made his last stand. No plaques, no monuments, just rubble and memories. That's fitting in a way. His sacrifice wasn't about claiming territory. It was about protecting his teammates in a moment of crisis. The ground itself didn't matter. His parents established a foundation in his name to support veterans and their families, a productive way to channel grief into action. The foundation funds mental health programs, transition assistance, family support services, addressing the invisible wounds that Cameron Baird might have carried if he'd survived. The work helps, but it doesn't fill the hole his absence created. The question that haunts every special operations community is whether units like SASR are sustainable in their current form. The training is so expensive, the skill set so specialized, the operational tempo so high. You're constantly burning through personnel. Some are lost, some are wounded, some just break mentally and can't continue. Replacing them takes years. The arithmetic doesn't work long term. Cameron Baird represents both the best and worst of that system. The best because he was exactly what the recruiting posters promise: elite, dedicated, willing to sacrifice everything for his teammates. The worst because that willingness enabled a system that demanded more than human beings can sustainably give. He did 5 rotations because guys like him always volunteer for one more, then one more, then one more, until there is no more. The Victoria Cross citation ends with standard military language about conduct beyond the call of duty. Baird's teammates would argue he was just doing his job. That's not humility. That's the SASR mindset. The impossible became routine. The extraordinary became expected. Men who should have been celebrated as exceptional were instead treated as the baseline. That culture produces amazing results and terrible casualties. His passing marked a turning point in Australian public awareness of the war. Before, Afghanistan was a distant conflict that other people fought. After, there was a face and a story that made it real. The debate about withdrawal intensified. Politicians who'd supported the deployment found themselves defending it to grieving families. The math was simple and brutal. What did we gain that was worth Cameron Baird's life? The answer depends on who you ask. Military commanders point to Taliban leaders eliminated, operations disrupted, Afghan soldiers trained. Politicians cite alliance commitments and global security. Baird's teammates talk about the men they saved, the compounds they cleared, the missions they completed. His family probably thinks about the boy who left and never came home. Different metrics, different conclusions. What's undeniable is that Cameron Baird's courage was real. The machine gun was real. The choice to move forward instead of back was real. Everything else, strategy, policy, justification, is interpretation. In that corridor, in that moment, interpretation didn't matter. Only action mattered. He acted, he went down. His teammates lived because of it. That's the only math that counts when bullets are flying. The final image that defines him isn't the funeral or the Victoria Cross or the memorials. It's that corridor in the House of Termination, smoke hanging thick in the air, the sound of automatic weapons fire echoing off mud walls. Cameron Baird moving forward because forward was the only direction he knew. Some men freeze when confronted with overwhelming danger, others retreat to safety. Baird walked straight into it without hesitation or theatrics. Just pure, lethal professionalism applied to an impossible situation. That's the legacy. Not superhuman, not invincible, just unwilling to quit, even when quitting would have been rational and defensible. The SASR continues to train operators in his image, highly skilled, fiercely loyal, willing to sacrifice. Everyone knows the cost now. Everyone understands that producing men like Cameron Baird means eventually losing men like Cameron Baird. The question is whether that trade is acceptable. The military says yes. The families left behind might disagree. He was 32 years old when he fell, an age when most people are establishing careers and starting families. Baird had already lived several lifetimes worth of combat experience, 5 deployments, hundreds of patrols, countless firefights, a medal for gallantry, and a posthumous Victoria Cross. He packed more into 3 decades than most people manage in 80 years. Whether that makes his passing more tragic or more inevitable is a question without satisfying answers. The House of Termination no longer exists except in classified reports and traumatic memories. Cameron Baird's decision to enter it reverberates through military culture, strategic discussions, and Australian society years later. Heroes are useful for recruitment and morale. They are less useful for honest conversations about whether wars are winnable or worth fighting. Baird's story can be either an inspiration or an indictment depending on which questions you choose to ask. What remains undisputed is this. When the moment came, Cameron Baird didn't hesitate. He saw what needed to be done, understood the cost, and did it anyway. That's courage in its purest form, not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let fear dictate action. The machine gun ended his life but couldn't touch that core of determination that defined him. It's what made him exceptional. It's what ended him. It's what we remember.